it's not just how many ships they sank, it's the fear of being sunk that they implanted in people. They caused a lot of havoc. They shot down a blimp near Bahamian waters. The list goes on and on, sort of disruptions. They sank indiscriminately. Sailing schooners, tankers were their favorite target. We were losing, for a period during World War II, a tanker every 10 hours. And at that rate, England wasn't going to get the oil they needed to continue the war. So we'll start with the first slide here. And this is the geographical area. And it's, I did this morning on Google Earth, so it's not very fancy the way I've drawn the lines, but if you have a concept of the panhandle of Florida over here, I'll just walk over to the closer. Hopefully you can still hear me. But here's the Florida panhandle, and this area here has been covered by other historians. So historians are very territorial. Hatteras has a number of books, Operation Drumbeat and the Torpedo Junction. So that area has like almost 10 U-boats have been sunk and like 100 ships were sunk just in this little area as they rounded that point. Here's the Bahamas here. The Bahamas starts in central Florida, goes all the way down. Back then it was a British colony, so it goes all the way down to the Haiti, the border with Haiti. So a tremendous amount of area. It's 10,000 square miles. If you took the Bahamas alone, which is 2,700 islands, they would equal more islands than the whole Caribbean together. And in Spanish, the name Bahamas means Baja for shallow, and mas too much. So it means shallow too much. Don't go there. So if you look on Google Earth, look at all this bright blue water. It's really beautiful. There's no mountains, so there's no streams, so there's no sediment, there's no pollution that's going to make the water dirty. And it's basically a big plateau, and it's like a tablecloth. And what the German submarines did is they didn't go hunt among the shallow waters because it was too dangerous. They just went around the edges. These deep channels here that dissect the Bahamas. So all they had to do was position themselves and sit in the channels, and they'd be flushed through like birds through a in a hunting context. So the Bahamas turned, these channels turned a 10,000 square mile area into 5 very bright channels. And the most important was the old Bahama Channel here. As you can see here, it's only 20 or 30 miles long. So it's wide at this point, so it's very narrow. And the Windward Passage, which is between Cuba and the Dominican Republic, the Crooked Island Passage, and then up here by Nassau. So there was 4 men buried on this island. So anyway, this is Savannah, Georgia, out to Bermuda, to Inagua or Antigua, which is the northeast corner of the Caribbean. And then I include some of these, all the big islands here. So any event that happened while ships were trying to get through here. So the important thing is that to get from Cuba, or to get from Latin America where they produce oil, or to get from Venezuela where they produce the ore for making airplanes, for making tanks and steel, and to get it up to New York and then over to England, they have to go through the Bahamas. It's the only place that made sense. It wouldn't make sense to go all the way out here and you could still get sunk. So this is where they went. And the Americans did not believe the submarines could get this far. But by sleeping together in the same bunk, by giving up space for instead of water, they gave up space for fuel. By going slowly underwater with just 1 engine instead of 2, by putting food in their bunks instead of bodies, they were able to double their range. And they also put what were called milk cows, or refueling stations, which are floating German submarines that supplied 5 or 6 different U-boats. So that's the geographical area. I call that the Bermuda Triangle, but that doesn't mean I necessarily believe in the myth of the Bermuda Triangle. So here's the challenge that the Allies had. But for those of you who don't know, the Second World War started with Germany invading Poland, essentially, and the British fought against the Germans as a holdout after France fell for 2 years, and they were really struggling. And the Americans were effectively helping the British, but were technically neutral. So from, it would have been 1939 until late 1941. And the British were really struggling. So Churchill, whose mother was American, really begged Roosevelt for help. But the Americans had been through the First World War, were pretty reluctant. So after Pearl Harbor, they came racing in early 1942, the end of 41. But in the meantime, we made a sort of a backhanded deal where we would supply the British, but not really admit that we were supplying them. So they gave us some air bases, and we gave them a bunch of old destroyers, and basically gave them tacit support. And what happened was, it was amazing. As soon as war was declared, the Germans got all their ships to come back to Germany so they could be used to supply Germany. Well, the Americans actually got between the British, it's a little confusing, but got between the British and the Germans and said, don't hold your fire to the British. They said, don't shoot these German ships because they're in neutral territory, we're not at war in the Americans, and you can't fire on a British ship, on a German ship. And so some German ships actually waited the whole war in American waters. So it's pretty fascinating stuff. And when the British succeeded in sinking the Columbus, which is the largest passenger ship afloat at the time, the Americans actually rescued the survivors and landed them in America so they could go and fight the war. So it's kind of little details of history that you wouldn't normally expect to hear unless you're really researching the fine print. But the challenge was, all these German, and it was mostly German, but they had half a dozen Italian submarines, came over to the U.S., to the Caribbean, to attack the supply lines, basically. And the worst attacks were the first 6-8 months of the year, and they would do what the Americans did in Japan, which is skip areas of high resistance and focus on weak spots. So they would pound the Bahamas for 3 months, and as soon as the defenses got too strong, they'd move somewhere else. They'd move to Trinidad, or they'd move to Latin America, or up to New York, or they'd go to Africa, they'd go to Indian Ocean. So it was only, they would have very intense attacks on a number of subs at once, and then move on. And during this time, about 150 ships, Allied or neutral ships, were sunk, and over 1,000 men were killed. And we're talking roughly a year or less of sustained attacks. So it was pretty, for those 100 just went missing, like never heard from again. And there were a lot more that were that survived, horrific, that was drifting in boats for weeks and weeks at a time. I call it a defeat. I don't see how you can call it a victory. We didn't have air cover, we didn't have enough ships to cover it. The Admiral King at the time, the Americans were really focused on fighting Japan. So a third of all losses by the Allies in the whole war happened in the Bahamas, Caribbean, Hatteras area in 1942. So the solution was the same thing that the British had devised, which is convoys. Put all your sort of, for lack of a better word, big, heavily laden merchant ships together and give them an escort. And sure, if a U-boat is attacking, you'll not get more targets, but the chances are that you can actually get the U-boat and sink it, or at least scare it away or force it underwater. The U-boats were really a warship that sailed on the surface most of the time, but could submerge when attacking. It was a lot faster on the surface, it was a lot more maneuverable, it had a lot better visibility when it was on the surface, and when there was no resistance, they did better. But when you had warships going after a U-boat, then they had to hide under the water and keep ducking, and they had something called depth charges, so they would be hounded underwater. ASW is anti-submarine warfare. I believe that your headmaster, Andy Chase's uncle, was involved in flying anti-submarine missions out of Bermuda. So a lot of young American men were trained and to go and kill U-boats, and that was strategically the way they won the battle. The Americans did was not focusing on trying to catch a submarine out in the open by using radio intercept and stuff. They would sit by the convoy and catch them as they attacked, or they would just exclusively go after, have no other job than to kill submarines. Having said that, only four submarines were sunk in this area, and however, 3,000 convoys got through. So we've already covered this area. There's a lot of passages there, but I feel we covered that already. Those are the names of the specific channels, but you got to see it verbally or visually. And this shows a lot of the confusion. If that map doesn't make any sense to you, it shouldn't, and it doesn't. So I can just show you here. This is the way the Allies divided this area. So here you have the Bahamas, and that's Florida. So this was the East Coast frontier here. This was the Caribbean Sea frontier. The Atlantic frontier, the Panama frontier. So it was really mixed up. And if the ship passed from one frontier to the other, and one frontier was in Key West, the other was in New York, the other was in Panama, they didn't necessarily talk to each other. So it was very, very confusing. These represent convoys, and I think that the ship had just been sunk here off Hatteras, which was the Lee Bridge in Cuba, and they were rescued by a concerted effort. Even when they were rescuing the men, the two rescue ships collided, one of them sank. So, it just shows how confusing, how very confusing the defense was. So this is the Italian effort, and the Italians were generally, to summarize their effort, they were extremely good at independent activity. They weren't as good at following, very strict instructions. and they were not good at all at attacking in concert with other submarines to do a sort of really disciplined, sustained, like convoy attack. Just, you know, the Germans, if they found a convoy, the first captain that found it would call in all his buddies and say, you know, follow me, and he'd send out a signal, and he wouldn't do anything. He wouldn't attack the convoy, no matter how much his chances at glory and fame. He would hold fire until all his U-boats assembled, maybe a week later, and then they would attack together. The Italians were like, hey, there's a ship, let's go sink it, and we're much more spontaneous, and they were much more aggressive, but not as effective. So the Italians did very well. Tazzoli on the left, especially, was like number 3 ranked for that period against the Germans as well. But eventually they withdrew. They had a lot of submarines, and the Germans needed a lot of submarines at the time. But eventually they withdrew back across the Atlantic. But it was a very important contribution. About a third of the ships that I'm covering were sunk by Italians. So move on. This represents, now you're used to this image now. You got Florida on the upper left, Haiti and Hispaniola and Cuba down on the left. Every single one of those white spots is a ship that was attacked. So there's so many that I couldn't fit them in. But there were roughly 130 at this count. Some ships were attacked and got away. There's a lot of ships, and that's just north of the Greater Antilles. So we had a lot of ships sunk off Florida. There are certain clusters, the Straits of Florida, which is called the Gulf Stream. They had a lot of ships sunk off Florida there, and one of the tankers burned for 52 days. So you've all heard of this, the Deepwater Horizon. I think that burned for 3 days before it sank, somewhere around there, for a weekend basically. But this ship literally burned for 52 days and beached in Hobe Sound, Florida. So you can imagine the psychological impact of citizens. You know, it shattered, when these ships were blown up, they shattered windows, bleeding sailors with concussion and oil all over them were dragged ashore. You had sort of people leaving bars at night in rowboats to try to rescue the sailors. At one point, a submarine got between the ship and the shore to fire outward, so he was only a couple hundred yards from the beach, so that he wouldn't hit the bystanders on the beach. And there were no records at all of the Germans killing helpless guys in lifeboats. That was basically another myth. So you have sort of myths about them getting support and food and supplies and oil from people on shore, and that's just not proven. It's not true. And I actually wrote a surviving German U-boat commander and got a reply from him, and he said, look, first of all, the reasons we didn't get any supplies from people in the Americas was, one, you know, we were terrified. We were in enemy territory, and we weren't going to get close to shore, you know, close enough to get supplies. Second of all, he said, we would never go near another village or town expecting to pass off as a tourist or to get supplies. And then the commanders had very strict orders not to do that. And last of all, you know, it was really shallow. So if a U-boat came close to land, he would be spotted by airplanes and probably bombed and sunk or run aground. And I said, well, what about you know, movie tickets? Because there were German sailors whose bodies were found with movie tickets for Broadway or that were captured alive with these tickets. He said it was simple. They all had girlfriends and families back home they wanted to impress. And when they interviewed survivors in these lifeboats or went aboard a ship to get supplies that were sinking, the sinking ships, they would sometimes go aboard and get flour and cigarettes and whiskey or whatever. They would take souvenirs. You know, why not? Look, here's a ticket from Broadway. So no one ever went to a Broadway show, but